Afghanistan, a land of mountains, deserts, and villages untouched by time, soon became the graveyard of thousands of dreams. After the 9/11 attacks in 2001, America sent its soldiers to fight the Taliban, believing the mission would be quick and decisive. But instead of a short war, it turned into 20 years of blood, loss, and pain. On October 7, 2001, less than a month after the 9/11 attacks, the United States launched Operation Enduring Freedom. The goal was to remove the Taliban from power and destroy al-Qaeda's safe havens in Afghanistan. That morning, the skies over Afghanistan filled with the sound of American fighter jets, bombers, and cruise missiles. Taliban training camps, communication centers, and government buildings were targeted in the first wave. Along with the airstrikes, CIA officers and U.S. Special Forces units quietly entered Afghanistan. They worked with the Northern Alliance, a group of Afghan fighters who had been resisting the Taliban for years. Together, they began pushing the Taliban out of their strongholds. These American soldiers were highly trained, but often operating in very small teams, moving through mountains and deserts they had never seen before. Many carried bundles of cash to pay local warlords for support, while others rode on horseback alongside Afghan fighters. At first, the Taliban appeared to collapse quickly. Cities like Kabul, Kandahar, and Herat fell faster than anyone expected. Taliban fighters left their posts, abandoning tanks and weapons. American soldiers thought the mission might be over within months. There was a sense of early victory, and back home in the United States, many believed the war would be short. But the Taliban had not truly disappeared. They avoided direct battles, retreating into the mountains of Tora Bora, the deserts of southern Afghanistan, and across the border into Pakistan. From there, they began planning a long and patient fight. Unlike regular armies that stood in open fields, the Taliban chose guerrilla warfare. They blended into villages, hid inside homes, and used the deep caves of Afghanistan as shelters. In 2002, the war entered a new stage. In the rough, unforgiving mountains of Paktia and Khost, patrols began to face deadly ambushes. Taliban fighters were patient and silent, waiting for hours along ridgelines, their weapons hidden beneath rocks or blankets. They studied the American patrol routes and learned where convoys were most exposed. Once the soldiers moved into narrow passes or valleys, the silence would shatter. Gunfire and rocket-propelled grenades rained down from cliffs, leaving little room to escape. One of the most dramatic examples came in March 2002 during Operation Anaconda. This was one of the first large-scale offensives of the war, meant to crush Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters hiding in the Shahakot Valley. American and coalition troops moved into the valley believing they had surrounded the enemy. Instead, they walked into a trap. More than 1,000 Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters had dug into caves and fortified positions high in the mountains. The Americans were caught in brutal crossfire. The battle lasted over 2 weeks, and it was fierce. Taliban fighters fired from hidden bunkers, while others launched mortars that echoed across the valley. U.S. helicopters trying to land reinforcements were struck by machine gun fire. Supply lines were cut off as roads became too dangerous to cross. At times, the weather made things worse. Thick snow and fog turned the mountains into a deadly maze. 8 American soldiers were killed, and many more were wounded. Coalition partners, including Afghan fighters and allies from other nations, also suffered losses. And as the Taliban grew bolder, they found new ways to target American soldiers. By 2004, they shifted tactics in a way that changed the war forever. They began using IEDs, or improvised explosive devices. These were homemade bombs, but the impact was devastating. With little money and basic supplies, Taliban fighters created weapons that could stop even the most powerful armies in their tracks. They buried the bombs under dusty Afghan roads, hidden in piles of rocks or disguised inside plastic containers, fuel cans, or even dead animals lying on the roadside. Wires stretched underground, leading to a trigger that could be set off by a man watching from a hillside, or by something as simple as a pressure plate. Soldiers driving through had no warning. One moment they were joking with each other, and the next, an explosion tore their vehicle apart, sending metal, fire, and dust everywhere. The provinces of Kandahar and Helmand, long considered the Taliban's heartland, were the deadliest. Convoys moving through villages or open highways were hit almost daily. The Humvees used in the early years of the war were built for speed, not survival. Their flat bottoms and thin armor offered little protection. When an IED went off, shrapnel ripped through the doors and floors, cutting down everyone inside. The Pentagon quickly realized the danger and rushed to introduce heavier vehicles, known as MRAPs, or mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles. These were designed with V-shaped hulls that could deflect blasts away from the crew. They saved countless lives, but even MRAPs could not guarantee safety. Some bombs were built so large they could flip the entire vehicle upside down, trapping soldiers inside as flames spread. Soldiers described the terror of driving down a road where every rock, every pile of dirt, or even a plastic bag blowing in the wind might be hiding a bomb. Some called it death by chance. No amount of training could prepare them for the randomness. The Taliban had found a way to strike fear without ever showing their faces. But the bombs were only part of the terror. By 2006, the Taliban began copying the brutal methods that had been used in Iraq. The most frightening of these was the suicide bomber. This was a weapon that no amount of armor or training could fully stop, because it relied on a person willing to die just to kill others. Cars were packed with explosives and driven at full speed into American convoys. The impact itself was deadly, but the blast that followed destroyed entire vehicles, scattering metal and flames across the road. Motorcycles, small and fast, became another tool. They could weave through traffic, approach checkpoints quickly, and then explode in an instant. Even men walking through markets or streets dressed like ordinary civilians strapped bombs to their bodies. They would blend into crowds until the final moment, when the explosion tore apart everyone nearby. This new wave of attacks forced American soldiers to live with constant suspicion. Every face became a question. A man carrying firewood on his back might just be heading home, or he might be hiding explosives. A child running towards soldiers might be looking for candy, or might be sent as a distraction before an attack. There was no clear line between friend and enemy. The Taliban also began using human shields. They hid inside crowded villages, firing from homes where families lived. They knew American soldiers would hesitate to shoot if there were women or children nearby. It was not just about survival. It was about turning compassion into a weakness. Many soldiers described the guilt that came with these moments. They had to make split-second decisions, knowing that one wrong shot could harm innocents, yet hesitation could cost them their own lives. And soon, one battle in a remote valley would show the full cost. In the summer of 2008, a group of American soldiers moved into the small mountain village of Wanat in Nuristan province near the border with Pakistan. The plan was to build a new outpost that could block Taliban supply routes coming from across the border. It was a remote and isolated place surrounded by steep hills and thick trees. From the start, the soldiers knew they were exposed. On July 13, 2008, just before dawn, the silence of the valley was shattered. More than 200 Taliban fighters launched a massive attack on the new outpost. They came from the surrounding ridgelines, firing down from higher ground with machine guns, mortars, and rocket-propelled grenades. The Americans were caught in a deadly trap. Their base had only been partially built, with defenses not yet strong enough to hold off such a large assault. The fighting was intense and chaotic. The soldiers used every weapon they had to try and push back the attackers. Some fought from trenches that were barely finished, while others fired from small buildings that quickly turned into death traps under heavy fire. The Taliban pushed closer and closer, and in some places the fighting came down to just a few meters. The battle lasted for hours. The Americans were badly outnumbered, and their defensive positions were collapsing one by one. By the time reinforcements finally arrived by helicopter, the damage was already done. 9 U.S. soldiers were dead, and 27 were wounded. Some of the men had been killed at point-blank range while trying to defend their positions to the very last moment. It was one of the deadliest attacks on American forces during the entire war, and it showed that the Taliban could take the fight directly to American bases. But it wasn't the last time they did. In October 2009, one of the most shocking battles of the war took place at Combat Outpost Keating, a remote base in Nuristan province. Only 54 American soldiers were stationed there. The base was built in a low valley, surrounded on all sides by steep mountains. This location made it almost impossible to defend, because enemies could fire down on the outpost from higher ground. Soldiers who lived there had long worried that the base was a trap waiting to be sprung. On the morning of October 3rd, more than 300 Taliban fighters launched a massive attack. They surrounded the outpost, firing from the ridges above. Rockets and mortars came crashing down, setting parts of the base on fire. Buildings burned, vehicles exploded, and communication lines broke down. The soldiers were under constant fire, with little chance to rest or regroup. At several points, the Taliban broke into the outer defenses, forcing the fighters into close quarters. Some soldiers had to fight hand-to-hand, knowing that if they fell, the enemy would take the base completely. For hours, the battle raged. Air support was called in, but even helicopters had trouble targeting fighters hidden in the mountains. The outpost itself was almost destroyed, and soon after the battle, it was abandoned. Many questioned why the base had been placed in such a dangerous location in the first place. The Taliban had turned Afghanistan into a chessboard of blood. But the pain was not only in big battles, it also came in betrayals. When the U.S. military began training Afghan soldiers and police to eventually take over the fight, trust was supposed to be the foundation of their partnership. American troops often lived, ate, and trained side by side with Afghan recruits. They taught them how to handle weapons, how to conduct patrols, and how to plan missions. But hidden within that cooperation was a dangerous problem. The Taliban realized they didn't always need to fight American forces directly. Instead, they began sending fighters or loyal sympathizers to join the Afghan army and police. These men would wear the same uniforms, carry the same weapons, and train under American supervision. But when the moment was right, they would suddenly turn their guns on the very soldiers who had been mentoring them. From 2010 to 2012, these green-on-blue attacks, where Afghan allies killed American troops, became one of the most feared threats. It wasn't just the numbers that made it terrifying, though dozens of U.S. soldiers lost their lives this way. It was the sense of betrayal. Soldiers who had shared meals, jokes, and trust with their Afghan partners suddenly found themselves ambushed at close range. In August 2012 alone, 15 Americans were killed by men wearing Afghan uniforms. These attacks often came without warning. Some Afghans were long-term Taliban infiltrators. Others had been radicalized over time or pressured by insurgents threatening their families. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. American soldiers realized they could no longer fully trust the people standing right beside them. They began carrying their weapons everywhere, even while sleeping or relaxing inside bases that were supposed to be secure. Meetings between Americans and Afghan forces grew tense, with U.S. troops keeping one hand on their rifles. On August 6, 2011, tragedy struck in Afghanistan. A U.S. Chinook helicopter carrying Special Operations Forces was flying through Wardak province during the night. The helicopter was on a mission to support troops already in a firefight. But as it approached its landing zone, Taliban fighters hidden in the area fired a rocket-propelled grenade. The helicopter was hit, and within seconds it crashed. On board were 38 people, including 30 Americans, 7 Afghan soldiers, and an interpreter. Among the Americans were 22 Navy SEALs, many from the legendary SEAL Team 6, the same unit that had carried out the raid that killed Osama bin Laden just 3 months earlier. All lives on board were lost. It became the single deadliest day for U.S. forces in the long war. The Taliban immediately celebrated. They wanted to show that no unit, not even SEAL Team 6, was untouchable. Their propaganda used this attack to inspire more fighters and prove that they could still strike back after bin Laden's death. Back in the United States, the news sent shockwaves through military families and the nation as a whole. For the relatives of the fallen, the pain was unbearable. These men were seen as some of America's strongest and bravest, yet they too were vulnerable. Many Americans who had followed the war closely began to ask why so many soldiers were still dying after a decade of fighting. When President Obama sent 30,000 extra troops to Afghanistan in 2010, many believed it could be the turning point of the war. The strategy was to push deep into Taliban strongholds. The hope that overwhelming numbers would crush the Taliban and give Afghan forces a chance to build control. But the reality was much darker. The fighting that followed was some of the most intense of the entire war. In 2010, nearly 500 American soldiers lost their lives. The following year, more than 400 were killed. These 2 years became the deadliest period for U.S. troops in Afghanistan. Thousands more were wounded, many losing limbs to roadside bombs. The surge created more battles, but not the clear victory that leaders had promised. American patrols often captured areas by day, only to see Taliban return by night. Soldiers were worn down, patrolling roads laced with explosives and knowing every step could be their last. For many, it started to feel like they were fighting the same battles over and over again with no end in sight. By 2012, frustration grew among the troops. They wondered if all the sacrifices were making any difference. The enemy seemed endless, and every gain was fragile. That's when the endless cycle of withdrawal and return came. By 2013, the United States began pulling its troops out of Afghanistan. Bases and small outposts that once held American soldiers were now turned over to the Afghan army and police. On paper, it looked like progress, but on the ground, the Taliban never really left. As soon as one place was cleared, the fighters would return after the Americans moved on. For the U.S. soldiers who stayed behind, it became a cycle that felt never-ending. They fought in the same valleys and villages again and again. A town that was secured with heavy losses in 2014 might be under Taliban control again just months later, or by the following year. The war felt stuck in a loop, with no real finish line in sight. The Afghan security forces were supposed to take full responsibility, but they struggled. Many units were poorly supplied, undertrained, and often faced corruption within their own ranks. Some soldiers and police deserted, while others secretly worked with the Taliban. This left American troops frustrated, knowing that their sacrifices often unraveled the moment they left. By 2016, U.S. forces were mostly in a support role, training Afghan troops, launching airstrikes, and carrying out special operations raids. But even then, the casualties kept coming. Every patrol carried the same risks as before. Roadside bombs, ambushes, and surprise attacks continued to kill and wound Americans and Afghans alike. Yet the Taliban had one last chapter to write. By the summer of 2021, the United States was preparing to leave Afghanistan after 20 long years of war. Bases were shut down, and troops were flown out by the thousands. The last mission was focused on getting as many American citizens, allies, and Afghan families who had helped the U.S. out of the country before the Taliban could fully take control. Kabul's airport became the center of the evacuation. Every day, thousands of desperate people crowded its gates. Families pushed forward, hoping to find safety on one of the last flights out. The scene was tense and overwhelming. Soldiers stood guard, trying to manage the chaos while also staying alert for attacks. On August 15th, the Taliban entered Kabul with little resistance. Within days, the city was theirs. This made the airport the only way out for those trying to escape. American troops, along with Allied forces, worked around the clock to keep the evacuation moving. It was one of the largest airlifts in U.S. history. But the danger was never far away. The Taliban weren't the only threat. Another group, ISIS-K, an Afghan branch of the Islamic State, wanted to prove they were still powerful. They saw the crowded airport as the perfect target. On August 26, 2021, tragedy struck. At the Abbey Gate, where U.S. Marines were searching civilians before they entered the airport, a suicide bomber slipped into the crowd. The explosion was massive, ripping through soldiers and civilians alike. In that single moment, 13 American service members were killed, including 11 Marines, 1 Navy corpsman, and 1 Army soldier. More than 170 Afghan civilians also lost their lives, people who had been hoping to escape. The attack was shocking, not only because of the loss, but because it happened so close to the very end of America's longest war. It was the last deadly strike on American forces in Afghanistan, sealing the war's final chapter in blood. The evacuation continued in the days after, but the sense of sorrow hung heavy. Soldiers carried the weight of knowing their last mission had ended in heartbreak. Families back home mourned loved ones who had survived years of deployment, only to die in the war's final days.